Hello, Behoblins. It's me again. I just wanted to make a follow-up video on the last one where I outlined the more detail on the road to Behodler 3. I presented some pretty cool features and how the ecosystem all fits together, and then I mentioned the desire for funding and how we plan to achieve that. And this was what was mostly focused on in the comments in Telegram, and I noticed that there was quite a flurry of misunderstanding, of narratives that weren't exactly true, a few false accusations flying about, and I thought I'd clarify a few things so that we are all on the same page, hopefully. So in this presentation, I think it's important to explain how we got to this point. I've noticed that I think some community members perhaps only check in once every few months, which is perfectly fine, of course. You're not obligated to monitor this and make this the central part of your life. But in doing so, you might construct incorrect checkpoints. So I'll discuss that a little bit more. I also want to discuss the sort of false opportunity costs that were implied. You know, if we go this route versus another route, there's this big pot of gold that you're missing out on route 1 by going on route 2. So I want to investigate that a little bit more. I want to talk a little bit about token locks. This is more, I call it misconceptions in this thing, but I guess it's more trade-offs and things to think about. But I guess there are some misconceptions because there's definitely a lot of anxiety and fear around this. And then I want to address security. This was actually brought up by one of the users, and it was something I wanted to save for later because it's a little bit low level, but I think it's important to bring up now. There's also a bonus slide at the end, which is, if you understand it, it should actually bring you quite a lot of joy and peace of mind. So I hope I can convey that. Please, before you comment in Telegram, please do watch this presentation and try to watch the other one. Well, at least before you comment in sheer anger, try to get through these presentations. Okay, so on April 11th, the state of the Behoblin ecosystem was that Limbo was almost ready. I don't know if you remember, but I was talking about how I had deployed various versions of Limbo to the testnet. Which testnet was it again? I think it was Goerli testnet. And it had been tinkered with, and there'd been a bit of iteration, and I was also adjusting the UI. Yeah, so the Limbo UI needed a few updates because Limbo had changed a little bit because of the audit, and so the UI needed to reflect that. And Behoblin 2 was working just fine. So everything was in place. Limbo was about to launch. We had Flan and Limbo DAO, and all of that code was all stable. It had all been audited. And in fact, even the deployment of Flan, the Flan Genesis event that I called it, that was all planned out and audited and ready to go. And then on April 12, an exploit happened. There was a slight difference in the amount of scarcity minted at low levels of liquidity. So this difference kind of vanishes at higher levels of liquidity, but a very ingenious exploiter managed to find this and inflated the supply of scarcity, and then dumped that scarcity on the Uniswap pairs, and so wreaked a whole lot of havoc. Okay, so what I've noticed a lot since that exploit happened, especially in latter months, and it sort of flared up again yesterday. So there was this, let's just say, a common theme that I sometimes saw where once we discovered the exploit and what had caused it and everything, we could just get back on track and go ahead and finish up and launch Limbo. And of course, the problem with that is that we're dealing with smart contracts. So if an exploit is found on a smart contract, generally that smart contract can't be used anymore. There's not like a patch that you can apply to a smart contract. So part of this misconception is, okay, so we just got to, whatever it means to deal with the exploit, and then launch Limbo. And then 10 months passed, and there's still no Limbo. So then people would return to the ecosystem to see what is going on, and they're like, where's Limbo? It hasn't launched. What have you been doing for 10 months? So this is what actually happened after April 12th. So Behoblin 2 was permanently compromised. That means that it can't be fixed. And that's just because of the nature of smart contracts. If you made Behoblin 2 able to be fixed, then it undermines the nature of a smart contract. It undermines the contracting nature. So we needed a Behoblin 3. In addition to this, because of the time frames and when Behoblin 2 was launched and all that, slowly over time, features had been accumulating that would have been nice to have been in Behoblin 2. So, the DeFi was moving on, and it would have been nice to have a modernized version of Behoblin. So a Behoblin 3 was always on the back burner. It was always in the pipeline. It just wasn't. Our hand wasn't supposed to be forced. It was going to be at some later stage. So anyway, the April 12 happened that forced our hand, and now we needed to bring project Behoblin 3 forward. It needed to be modernized. It needed to have. It needed to be streamlined. If you actually watched the previous presentation, you would have seen how. I guess I don't go into the code, but I do allude to the fact that a lot of workarounds and a lot of like proxy layers and so on Behoblin 2 are just streamlined into Behoblin 3. And of course, it would need to be audited, because unfortunately, of all the things that were audited in the ecosystem, Behoblin 2 wasn't, and it was live, and you don't want to audit a live AMM. We don't want to audit a live contract at all. It seems like in DeFi, every time someone audits something live, there's an exploit. So after this Behoblin 2 hack, there was a deeper concern, obviously, for getting security right. So I went on a kind of a journey into the wilderness to really rethink security and to really ponder about it. I'll speak a little bit about that now, because it's not as simple as auditing. In addition to that, I'd mentioned before a few times that Limbo, while being audited and tested, and even tested on testnet, it had some novel economics that had not been tested in the wild, and you can't really know if novel economics works until you test it and you gather data and so on. So like price tilting. It works, obviously, it works mechanistically, but it hadn't really been tested in the wild. So, putting all this together, we needed to get to the point where we could raise money for building Behoblin 3, and in the meantime, build up a kind of a bridging ecosystem in which we could test these individual novelties of Limbo, so that by the time we launch it all, we've got everything economically tested in a kind of a sandpit environment. So that's where Flax came in. Flax is a kind of a bootstrapping bridge between scarcity and flan. That's why it sounds like flan, but it's got the X. That's the scarcity. So Flax was a kind of way to get us from broken Behoblin 2 to Behoblin 3 with all of these individual components tested and refined, so that was the goal. So Flax was never a side gig. Flax was always a kind of an innovative pivot to get us from broken Behoblin 2 to Behoblin 3 in the most responsible way, and in a way that would generate real data and generate hopefully some money. So Bonfire would be brought forward. Bonfire was always on the roadmap. If you go look at the Behobla site, you'll see there's a little placeholder for Bonfire. So Bonfire was always on the roadmap. And what we would do is we would bring Bonfire forward instead of launching it after Limbo, so that we could put to test a bunch of burn-based assumptions in Limbo, as well as price tilting, which is at the core mechanism of how Flan would be priced. And then as a byproduct, Bonfire would get scarcity and I burning. So the desire was to get Bonfire burning scarcity and I enough so that we could recover that liquidity and we could recover that I price, and so that we could then generate the revenue required to audit Behoblins 3. So the Flax model was entirely cohesive and coherent and in line with the with getting the roadmap back on track. And the experiment of running Bonfire, running Flax, did yield some interesting results, some unexpected results. So number one, price tilting does work. That's fairly clear. Number two, which was, it sounds intuitive, but it has a kind of a, there's dynamic relationships going on here that doesn't always necessarily mean that two is super intuitive. So the number two was that monetary stability, stabilizing a coin, does actually require a certain volume of threshold, even if your stabilization mechanism is stable from one day to the next. There's a kind of a volume that's required to keep the stability, and without that volume of trade, the token gradually loses its stability. So this is important for Flan, because we obviously wanted to stabilize Flan, and we wanted to use price tilting as a way of doing that. Another thing that came forward was that the community, the Behoblins community, is not comfortable with curve and pendle levels of complexity in DeFi. So they wanted things to be a lot more simple. I surveyed and I also tested. I borrowed concepts from standard DeFi dApps, and I noticed that there was an aversion to anything that wasn't incredibly straightforward. So there was a lack of a desire to experiment with funky things. Obviously not like across the board, but let's say there was a sizable amount of Behoblins who didn't want to deal with hairy, complicated DeFi apps, which is fine. That's not a criticism. It's just an observation. And this is an interesting one. So locking up, this might also be this is difficult to know if it's a global phenomenon or if it's just a Behoblin phenomenon, but locking up unstable rewards is considered too risky to even participate in the app at all. So we would get APYs of Flax. While Flax had a high price even, we had APYs of Flax on Bonfire that were out of this world. But the idea of waiting, whatever it was, 180 days or however long, if you did it longer, for something that was not stable was considered too much of a risk, even at those percentages, which is quite curious because economic models don't predict that. They basically just predict that people would factor in an interest rate with which they were comfortable. But here it seemed like there was a sort of a threshold. So if we were handing out a very stable coin as a reward, then I would imagine people would be pretty happy with long-term lockups. That's not to say that locking up assets in order to get rewards is undesired. So that would be the curve model. So putting that all together, working with the data and iterating so that we could produce something that would be pleasing and useful to the Behoblin community, and would carry on getting us towards this eventuality of getting back on track, launching Limbo and so on, is when Reflex started being designed. So in response to Bonfire's experiment, goals emerged. Right. So the first goal is that we don't want to rely on bootstrapping ourselves, of picking us up by our bootstraps in order to get stablecoins to work. This is the sort of the flywheel effect. And I mean, the reason for that is obvious. So a lot of a lot of big DeFi outfits, they fake the flywheel effect by bringing in massive retail investors from Wall Street or whatever and sort of getting the flywheel going. But what would be more desirable is if we could bring in external yield to augment the community yield. So this is what Convex does, right? So Convex piggybacks on the existing yield in Curve and plays by the Curve rules in order to channel that into the Convex ecosystem. So that's the first thing we want to do, because then if we could augment the community demand, it means that we wouldn't need a massive community to start with, and then we wouldn't have this chicken and egg effect, right? That was always the goal with Limbo as well. But running this in the real world, running these experiments, we can actually see that in action and how this would work. We needed to achieve flax, so we always wanted to achieve flax deflation, and the hedgy locking was the first attempt at doing that. But it was clear that locking rewards that are unstable, as I said, is an undesirable proposition, no matter how high the APY. Again, this isn't clear if this is a global phenomenon or just a Behoblin phenomenon. But what we wanted to now get is we want to achieve deflation of flax without locking rewards. In other words, we want to be able to pay people flax immediately while still achieving a deflation of the total flax supply. And if we do that, then we will get a net increase in the price of flax. And we need a simple UX, right? People were quite clear that they don't want anything more complex than an AMM. They don't want to have to deal with like crazy Pendle levels of UX complexity. So in response to this, that's when I started producing Reflax and SFlax. And so this is now, each number here corresponds to the numbers above. So, and by the way, I'm going to get into the locking and all of that now. This isn't just a technical presentation, but it would help to sit through this technical presentation, the technical part of the presentation. So we augmented the community demand. We augment the community demand by sucking in yield from Curve, Pendle, Beefy, etc. And we get massive APYs. Right, so I've explained this a few times, but you know, on those particular platforms, you would get APYs of 30%, sometimes 40, sometimes 80, sometimes lower, 20, but that's still pretty high. And then Reflex would be designed such that, because of these high APYs are obviously not eternally sustainable, so you need like a swapping out of the vault mechanism. So Reflex was designed with that as well, so that when one vault, like a target vault on Curve, would run out of rewards, we could under the hood swap that out and target the next vault, so we can just move between them and keep up these high APYs. Flax locker, so that's where SFlax comes in. So a very simple flax locking mechanism in order to boost your APY. So not only would you get these massive APYs, but you would be able to boost them even higher. You know, so there would be we'd have a Reflex vault that's targeting a Curve pool that's getting 30%, and then in return for locking a bunch of flax, you might boost that up to 50%, 60%. And that allows us to get a net deflation. So if you think about, like, intuitively, suppose you lock $100 in order to get a boost of 1% APY. The APY is per year. So the circulating supply of that token would decrease by $100. And then that APY would trickle in, like the 1% or whatever it is, over the course of a year, which would be $1 extra. So the supply would go up $1, but it would go down by $100, right? And this is the dynamic that Curve and others use. So it's not that you're losing or anything, but you can still increase the reward for everyone while still getting a net decrease in the circulating supply of flax. And then this is a kind of a virtuous cycle, because once that gets going, the flax price starts rising, people are more willing to lock it and wait and save their flax. Simple UX, right? So the great innovation of Reflex is that you deposit something like USDC or ETH, and you don't claim like a whole fleet of tokens like you do on these other farming dApps. all of your rewards. So, like for instance, if Reflex is targeting some pool and it has like 3 different tokens, when you claim, all of those tokens get sold and converted into Flax, and the Flax gets sent to you immediately. And in the process, the Flax price is tilted. So you get a reward, and the Flax price instantly goes up a little bit, and the liquidity increases a little bit. And you get that reward immediately. So if you don't trust Flax, the token, like you think it's going to lose value, you can immediately sell that reward. You don't have to worry about the stability of Flax. So, if you're getting rewarded in something and you can immediately sell it, you don't really care whether it's a stable coin or not, assuming it's not like plummeting at the time. So that does away with the whole concern about, I don't want to lock anything, or I don't want to participate in this app at all because I don't want to wait 180 days to get my Flax only to discover that my Flax has fallen in value. So we took that whole situation out. So it's very simple UI. You deposit USDC, you get paid in Flax. That's it, right? From the end user perspective. It's as simple as that. Now, getting back to Behodler would need to be rewritten, as I mentioned. And the nice thing about this is that it gave us an opportunity to solve all of the issues that gradually crept up in Behoblins 2. One of those issues was the early bird attack problem. That's where when you add the very first unit of a token in a bonding curve, it produces an enormous amount of scarcity, and this is just a consequence of the logarithmic bonding curve. And there were lots of hacks suggested to get around that. But none of them were perfectly satisfactory, and a lot of them added to insecurity. Now in Behoblins 3, that wouldn't be the case, so we wouldn't have a huge chunk of scarcity being minted. However, this decision would now impact Flan, because Flan was predicated on actually using all of that massive amount of scarcity. So Flan was paired up on Uniswap with every time there was a Behoblins migration, and it would produce like 700 scarcity. That scarcity would then be sent to Uniswap and paired with Flan. Now, Uniswap doesn't understand the whole logarithmic bonding curve thing. And so from Uniswap's perspective, Flan would suddenly have like $90,000 of extra liquidity. So that was actually that was a feature of Flan in getting the algorithmic stablecoin to be stable in the first place. And then I wrote that monetary policy paper, which came with all the caveats and the formulas to make sure that you keep that equilibrium, because obviously if you misplay your hand in that, you can end up with disaster. But now with Behoblins 3, that whole algorithmic Flan situation would be removed. So Flan, originally an algorithmic stablecoin, which is a bit of a concern because, it's difficult to keep an algorithmic stablecoin stable. Most outfits who've tried that have collapsed into either a partial reserve and so on. And so it's not impossible, and it definitely could be achieved if we played our hands right, but it is more risky, and it's also a little bit more risky from a regulatory point of view. There's that situation where Flan, although backed by a lot of scarcity, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, as I said, all that extra scarcity would convince Uniswap that it has a lot of liquidity, but if all of that scarcity somehow got loose, it could cause a lot of havoc. So all of that's gone from Behoblins 3. The specter of too much scarcity chasing too little Behoblins is gone in Behoblins 3. Limbo and Flan are also Uniswap version 2 based. So Uniswap version 2 was at the core of Limbo migrations, and Flan was paired up with Uniswap version 2. So that creates an external dependency, and it's also it's an aging AMM. So it would be desirable to kind of move on from that. And what Flax really demonstrated in Bonfire is that you really need a lot of momentum. So there's a chance that we could hit the ground running and get a lot of momentum with Flan, but that beginning era is, let's just say it's a little bit more nerve-wracking with the original conception of Flan. Now, Behoblins 3 comes with an ability to handle small caps without instability. So in Behoblins 2, you always had to make sure that when you added a new token to the Behoblins 2 AMM, it needed to have a TVL, or an average. It needed to have a TVL equal to the average across Behodler. That's if there were 10 tokens on Behodler 2, and each one had $1,000 of liquidity, then if you add a new token, you've got to add it with exactly $1,000 of liquidity. If you add more liquidity than 1,000, then the token will be underpriced. The token will be overpriced, and if you add less, the token will be underpriced. So Limbo had to be very careful about that. In Behodler 3, since you can have small caps now, you essentially take away that risk factor from Limbo, and Limbo's role is now different. So Limbo can still facilitate migrations, and it's still desirable to add high TVL tokens to Behodler. So Limbo still has that role, but it's a little bit different now. And so Limbo and Flan could both do with upgrades, keeping the best of the old. So like the staking logic of Limbo is tried and tested, not just within the Behodler ecosystem, but it's originally based on the MasterChef contract from Sushi. So it's a very mature chunk of code, and you don't want to mess with that too much. But like the migration logic of Limbo could be improved. And the governance might be simplified as well in Limbo, although that has to be investigated. Flan, on the other hand, could go through a complete rewrite where it could be taken from an algo stablecoin to something maybe more stable. So I covered that in the last presentation. Again, I would advise you look at that, because the improvement of Flan is very hard to understate. It's really an improvement in every single way. And that's how we got to the 4 pillars model, which has only really matured recently. Right? So it's taken many months, much iteration, much thinking, much strategizing and observing of data and gathering data and holding all these different factors in tension with one another. Always with 2 goals in mind. One, to be something that the Behoblin community would want to use and would benefit from. That's why I take into account all of your preferences with regards to, that stuff I covered earlier. But then obviously expanding to something that would benefit the world and would be desirable for the world to make use of. But what the 4 pillars model does the best is that it minimizes the need for hopium. Right, so in Behodler 2, we had that concept of auto mining, which you could still have in Behodler 3, but that was the idea of taking external liquidity pairs like Uniswap and so on and putting scarcity in them, and then finding ways to trade scarcity through those pairs so that scarcity burns. So that second part, that finding ways to trade scarcity, that's where the hopium comes in, right? You've got to get your strategies right. You've got to get Limbo right. You've got to hope that people are using it. You've got to hope that bots understand how to use it. And then, of course, the other role for hope in Behodler was the algorithmic stablecoin of Flan. So I'm quite happy with that monetary policy paper I wrote, because it doesn't give you a strict formula, because that would be foolish to draw up a theoretical model and then come with a formula and then think that that's going to work. But rather, it outlines the kind of the fence of risk in which you must stay. So it kind of mathematically, it takes a more of a sort of a Nassim Taleb approach of highlighting the areas of like danger, don't go near that cliff. And then if you can stay within the fence, it works. But nonetheless, there's still that need to stay within the fence, right? If you go to the fence, if you go too close to one of the fences, you fall off a cliff. Right? So that's all eliminated from the 4 pillars model. So it's much more stable and much more subject to steady growth as opposed to wild, volatile, and then sometimes crashes. Now, I mentioned before security is important, and I want to just quickly take you on a journey of where I've been on that, because I put a lot of time and thought into this. It's kind of a whole philosophy behind security. So audits are invaluable, but they have shortcomings. So I noticed after Limbo had been audited, now Limbo had got an excellent audit. Going through C4 is probably one of the best ways that you can get audited, because you just the sheer number of eyes and talented eyes looking at it from all different angles. But as I was tinkering with Limbo leading up to the testnet, I found one or two little issues that weren't picked up in the audit, which made me wonder, was there anything else that wasn't picked up in the audit? So that was a little concerning. I had to, that did a bit of a double take for me, because I was surprised that I was finding things. I really thought that the whole scope would have been covered. Now, ever since the beginning of programming, or ever since the beginning of modern computing, Alan Turing days, informal verification has been held up as the kind of fusion power of programming. It's something that would radically transform software security, but it was always 30 years away, and it's been that way for the last 30 years, and it always will be 30 years away, and that's one of those things. And informal verification is basically just mathematically proving your code, which is sounds amazing, right? It's amazing that such a thing is possible. Microsoft started making headway with this, and it's actually how they began to eliminate their blue screens of death. But it was only when Ethereum launched that Vitalik revived this, because he and his insight realized that the block state of a blockchain is this closed system. It's a closed entity that doesn't rely on external actors. So within the state of a block, it's deterministic, and it's finite. Right, a block of execution only has so much gas. So it's actually the perfect realm in which to develop formal verification. And so, heeding his call, people started getting on it. I covered that. And Satora came up with a wonderful formal verification language and a tool set that they actually took from airline safety. So they've been using formal verification techniques on planes, and obviously, I mean, the security requirements of a plane are possibly higher than in financial software. So applying that rigor, we've now got this wonderful formal verification language where you can actually, define relationships, and then the software will actually prove if those relationships always hold, which is incredible. I mean, there's some sort of sorcery going on in there. And then coupled with that is a concept called mutation testing. And if you put formal verification together with mutation testing, you've got the perfect solution, really. Because with formal verification, you kind of prove that your code works. But there's always the concern that, have you written enough proofs? Have you got code that's passing the proofs that maybe shouldn't be, and so on? And so what mutation testing does is it introduces random bugs into your code. And if the tests still pass after the random bugs have been introduced, then it suggests that something's wrong with your testing. In other words, it's a false positive, right? You shouldn't, if there's a random mutation, it should cause your code to break in some way, and that should be picked up by your formal verification. So you kind of iterate back and forth between this mutation testing and this formal verification until you've got this solid structure. And of course you audit as well, right? So and then with there's a whole bunch of auditing tools, automated software, and with AI, it's getting better and better at picking up bugs. So you kind of cover the entire spectrum, and you finally release code that you can be confident in. Because if I think about the exploit in April, and I think about any exploit that I've been involved in or have witnessed, there's always a relationship that is assumed to hold, or maybe has been shown to hold, that the exploiter can find some way of showing that relationship sometimes doesn't hold. So I could have stated that sort of relationship model with the Behoblins exploit as well. If I had used formal verification on that particular relationship, the exploit that the hacker found would have been picked up in the testing, and then we would have eliminated that. Okay, so another concern that was brought up was this whole concept of why do you need 4 developers? I think someone said You always said you didn't need more developers, they would just bog you down, and now you say you need more developers, what's going on, and so on. Again, we have to look at this Behoblin ecosystem prior to April 12 and after April 12. Things have changed drastically. So prior to April 12, it was just me needing to finish Limbo. Limbo is the culmination of a lot of thought and work, as is Behoblin, and so if I was that close to finishing it, it had already been audited. The idea of bringing someone on and having to train them up would add many months. It just seemed the benefit to it was outweighed by the costs. You could make the argument that by inducting someone into the ecosystem, eventually it would be worth it. With a junior developer, when you bring a junior developer into a company, they are not making the company money probably until they're well into their senior developer phase. It's definitely like a Pareto situation where there's this like one dude at the company who's basically pulling the whole company forward, and there's just like a whole boatload of juniors that are a sort of a deadweight, but they're learning to not be a deadweight, right? So we didn't want that situation going on. Now, discussing the manpower after the 4 pillars strategy that I outlined in the previous video, we've now got this situation. It's not just me tinkering to finish Limbo. We've now got this ecosystem that's fully thought through, fully thought out. There's no longer any what ifs going on. There's no longer any we'll handle that down the way, a roadmap sort of thing. So the first thing is the reflex contracts. They need to be tested and completed if they're not completed. And using all of these new testing models, and they might need to be refined. Some old stuff might need to be thrown out. Some of the code I've written in Reflex was very, very like specific to certain curve vaults, so that might need to be made more generic. So that would take one full-time Solidity developer. The Reflex UI needs to be, so I do have a UI at the moment. It's fairly nice, but someone with UI expertise and UX and so on might want to give that a look and get that right. They might want to throw out a whole lot of the old code. Flan and Behoblin, so that's where a lot of novelty and complexity come in. I would be taking the reins in that, but having a co-developer would certainly help and would streamline that whole process. And then Limbo would need to be re-geared to move away from the V2 model and to be more compliant with the Behoblin 3 model. And of course, with all of that comes all of that testing and so on, and all of that security application. I would obviously be playing a role in all of these, be putting on all these hats, especially in the beginning. So you can see the manpower there's about 4, maybe 5 people, or not necessarily, it could be 4 with 1 rotating, jumping. But if we did that, we would get the whole thing done like in a matter of months, assuming we found the developers. So let's compare parallel universes, because there was this opportunity cost screeching that happened in Telegram, where it was implied that if we move to this new funding model, it's like a grand scale theft. Okay, so the previous video, the one I launched yesterday, well, the one I put out yesterday or the day before, whenever it was, explained the problem with trying to fund development with I. So I would go look at that again so that I don't regurgitate it here. But essentially, it's not possible to fund development with I as it is. If it's just me, it would take quite long, possibly, to get all of these 4 pillars perfectly working and to make sure that they're not secure and rushed, to get the UI working. It could possibly take quite long. Whereas multiple devs could get it done in a few months. So we could, if we had like just me or if we had just one dev, what we could do is we could do one piece at a time. Because although the whole ecosystem works together, there is an order in which you can build this such that you're building value while you go. So you would start with Reflex, get Reflex working, and then Reflex would be an app of its own and it would generate its own value. Then you would move on to Flan, you would create Flan, and you would invert Bonfire. You could swap the order of those two. And then you would have to list Flan on Bonfire so that Flan would start growing, as I said in the last video. And then finally, you could launch Behoblin 3. And then I guess that's penultimately, because you would still need limbo. Right? So we could do it one at a time like that. But the ecosystem has a kind of a synergistic effect. So everything works together much better when it's all working at the same time. So getting those flywheel effects and getting that fast growth and growing that pie really big works when the ecosystem's all working together. So those are the two parallel universes that we can choose. The one is that we get to the finish line quickly, and then the pie starts growing very fast. It gets very big very quickly. The approach where we take me is we gradually grow the pie, but if you compare at any given time frame going forward, the size of the relative pies are going to be there's going to be quite a huge difference between them in these parallel universes. So let's talk about that. So this is the bonuses of taking this fast approach where we have multiple developers. The complete ecosystem would obviously be much better for the market cap, for the token prices, for the entire tokenomics. All of these things would be working as a cohesive whole, and then that would we could bring in new users. We could bring them in without excuses, saying things like, well, this is half the ecosystem, please wait, and having a whole explanatory process. We could just bring them in and let them use it. And the most exciting part is once we've got these 4 pillars in place, we now have a system and a structure in place where we can start rolling out features in a production line. So me, I'm always finding some new feature that would be really nice to add, but it kind of gets added to a Trello board. It would be nice to start rolling these out, starting with Pyroloans. So I wrote Pyroloans, the concept, and we've had it audited about 3 years ago. And every time I go back and look at that paper, I'm amazed at what a wonderful concept it is. Like, it really would transform the borrowing scene in crypto. It would have a very, very big impact on borrowing. And it would be nice to actually get that out. So once we've got the 4 pillars in place, we can immediately start pumping out Pyroloans at a good speed. Because we'd have a team of developers. Maybe we'd scale back to just one extra developer. We get that developer to work on Pyroloans, and I'd oversee it, or maybe 2 developers, whatever the case is. And it wouldn't just be me writing articles and articles and articles about all these great features that are coming, but instead we'd be expanding at a high speed. We'd be actually bringing these features at a faster pace. And we would be innovating at a pace that I would say would be better than most in DeFi, because currently it's like we have these wonderful apps that are waiting to be built, but we don't have the production line to build it. So having this ecosystem out there, we can really start building our production line. I don't know if an analogy works here, but it's kind of like once you've got if you think about a place like Amazon, so Jeff Bezos focused on his books business, and then once he had that in place, he could then start rolling out. As a necessity, he started working on what eventually became AWS, because that was helping the books sell better. But then AWS could be spun out into what it is now. And then once those resources were in place, he now had the market demand and the marketplace where he could start producing something very niche like a Kindle and yet have it sell and the mass market and so on. So he could begin rolling out these production line of ideas. Obviously, Elon Musk has a similar system going where he starts off with PayPal and then he rolls it into a wobbly SpaceX and a Tesla, and eventually they all start working together so that Tesla is driving his astronauts to the launch pad. We'd also have, as this rolled out, we'd have multiple opportunities for revenue sources. There's some obvious ones like having a FLAN fee that goes to a revenue pool and so on, and that would mean So just to be clear, so if we took this fast approach, we would have so many more opportunities for revenue that the specter of us ever having to sell governance tokens again to fund development would just leave. We no longer need to do that. And we don't want to do that. No one wants to sell their primary governance token, right? So that's not a preference of anyone. We could then lock those governance tokens away and forget about them, right? And we'd have this revenue coming in. So I want to address some misconceptions that were put forward about the raising of funds. And it was probably put for, I think it was all put for, I mean, it was put forward in good faith. I don't think there were any malicious actors, but I think it was that there were incomplete pictures. And so, understandably, that can cause a bit of road rage. So, the first one, the biggest one, and this needs to really come across because this is a standard concept in Silicon Valley. This is a standard concept in traditional company production, in the traditional stock exchanges and TradFi and so on. The way that money is raised is that there's always a share dilution, right? So to give an example, in the year 2000, I think that's when I learned about this fact. I discovered that Bill Gates only had 6% of Microsoft, even though he was the richest man in the world, right? So the Microsoft pie got bigger, but it could only get bigger if he had his share diluted, right? So this is these series of funds that with the standard Silicon Valley approach is that someone comes up with an idea and they have 100% of the share, or maybe they split it 50-50 with their partner. And then as they bring on seed round and Series A and Series B and so on, they have to obviously seed that percentage, but they're doing it because the pie is growing bigger, right? And they wouldn't do it if the pie didn't grow bigger than the amount that they're giving up, right? So it would be irrational to give up 10% of your company if your company is only going to grow by 5%, because now you've lost, right? So we can obviously infer that these people are only giving up 10% of the company because the company grows by 30% or 80% or 100% or whatever it is, so that 10% becomes worth more. So the idea of if I dilute my share in the total, I get less money, that's just not true. And we've made it not true from day one, because obviously there's that, I've said that for every token you have, you get a large dollar multiple. And that's okay. Well, I'll get to like the second point of what I was just saying. But another one that came up, which doesn't really make sense, it really can't make sense if you think it through, is sure you can raise funds, Justin, but don't dilute my share at all. So how do I raise funds? Like, how do we bring on new investors if everyone who currently owns I is the total of all the I holders? How does that work? What would be the point of launching a new token or a governance token? What would be the point? Like traditionally, what a company would do is they wouldn't be a hard cap on I, but they would issue more I. And obviously, we don't do that. But how can I? It's impossible. How can you bring on investors? Essentially, what you're saying is let the investors put their money into the product and give them nothing in return. So they're just donating. There's another one that's important, which is the what I've noticed is, okay, there's obviously the time risk. So there's obviously timing the market, right? You're producing a product and then you don't just miss the bull run, but it's more that the technology or the preferences of the market move in such a way that you've got to change things. So there's this constant sort of wasted upgrade labor. It might just be that your Solidity version you're using is old, or it might be that you're working with a particular paradigm and now the entire market has signaled that they hate that paradigm, and so you've got to move and pivot. But if you'd got in there before the market had shifted, you probably could have moved with the market, or you could have produced something that was a novel upgrade or so on. So like a nice example of this would be all of these burn-on transfer tokens that we have in Behoblins 2. They were very desirable at a certain point. They were kind of like the hot thing in DeFi. And now they've become hated by most protocols. Like the V3 protocols all hate burn-on transfer tokens. And bridging burn-on transfer tokens is not trivial. And so there's this kind of like inherent hostility towards burn-on transfer tokens. So then there has to be this sort of like upgrade approach. And there's a lot of uncertainty in that. So the longer you take, the more uncertainty you build into it. And you could have a novel feature. I mean, some of the stuff that we're producing in Behoblins, it's still novel and it's still innovative. Like Pyro Tokens 3, don't really need to change it. After all these years, it's still gonna bring novelty to the market. So you don't always know when you're building something if it's going to be subject to this sort of change or not. So in the meantime, that's kind of wasted labor if you're constantly retrofitting code that you've written before. So obviously bringing a lot of people on would help reduce that. There was a point I wanted to cover, but it might come up in the next slide. So if it doesn't, I might circle back. So let's talk about token locking. Oh, controversial topic. This is the one where people are being murdered in Telegram. Okay, so this is a kind of a I don't know if it's a narrative, a misconception, or if it's sort of a cynicism, but there's this idea that we're going to lock the tokens away for 300 days, sit in our hands, and after 300 days, they can unlock and everyone's going to dump. And it kind of skirts around the whole, like, what are we doing in those 300 days? Right? So if we're bringing multiple developers on, we obviously want to have this product completely finished before the 300 days is up, so that there's liquidity, there's more liquidity for the governance token, and there's a desire to actually hold this token so that when it unlocks, there won't be just a massive dump. And you see this with DeFi products, right? Most DeFi products that manage to have the project running successfully by the time the unlock happens, which, by the way, is very common. It's not as new as you all might think, but once the product is running, there's a lot of holding. There's a lot of people who don't want to drop it, and we can see this with just about any token, any project where the unlock happened after the product launched. So I said there. So it's the zero-sum thinking of, like, we're just gonna all dump our token, and because if it was a worthless product and there's just liquidity sitting in Uniswap and you've got this token that's worthless, well, obviously you would dump it. But in that sense, it's a failed project. So it's almost like everyone's saying that having this token lock and then having an unlock date is kind of, that's why I said it might be cynicism, because it's kind of like everyone's just on board that it's a failure. Whereas the 4 pillars approach, this Limbo-powered Flan, AMM, this whole ecosystem, we got Reflex. We might have, by the time the token unlocks, we might already have Flan burning the governance token, burning SCY. We might have Reflex burning it. So, so there's been mention of milestones versus time. And I'm very, I like the idea of milestones. That was my initial thought, was to have unlock batches after milestones, or to just have one final milestone, like, Flan is working well, and to unlock. The problem with this approach is that, it's obviously subjective, and 2, it requires me to write unique code to do with locking and unlocking, and even if I borrow someone else's code, I'll need to tinker it and change it and so on. And that takes time, and it introduces risk. So the benefit of using a time-based lock is that there are a whole bunch of dApps that are already written, that are already, they've got UIs, they've got the whole thing. You've got you can, whether it's Hedgie, for instance, with the time-based lock, if you're doing a private sale, or there are a number of alternatives for public token sales where it's literally like a wizard, and you just put in your token address and you put in the parameters, and then it locks it for a certain amount of time. So that is a big, as a non-pun way of saying this, using a time-based lock saves a lot of time. So just remember that, keep in the back of your mind that the 300 number, which was chosen, and by the way, still under negotiation, but the 300 number that was chosen was so that, precisely to allay these fears, so that by the time the unlock happens, the ecosystem is well underway, and there's value in it, and there's liquidity in it, and there's a desire to hold these tokens and to make use of governance features. Remember, a lot of people are going to be, the moment they get these tokens unlocked, they're going to be locking them straight into Limbo to be part of the governance decision making. So it is actually a token that is part of the parametric governance of Limbo. Another thing to think about is that there will be an LP token at some point, which will, if all the tokens are locked, but there's this LP token that has SCY on it, the only way to get SCY would be to buy it. In other words, the only way to get your hands on SCY on the open market would be to first push up the price, whatever the initial price was. And if everyone who did that immediately or later on dumped their tokens back into the pool, the price would return to its original level. In fact, because of fees, it would return to a slightly higher level. So this LP token that's sitting there would be a source of constant price growth or price stability until the unlock. Then things change, obviously. Now, if we were to give, this might be more controversial, but it should be intuitive. If we were to give like some crazy generous offering of a conversion rate of SCY to I, which again, how would this be funded? So say for, I've heard comments of like, I bought I at $2 per I, so I should get like $10 per I. Well, if we were to do that, then the incentive to dump is like built into the system. If you've got a token for X dollars and then you got some mass, and at the very, very high market high, and then you got this massive reward, which at the current market price is just astronomical, who wouldn't sell? I mean, I know I would. I've been part of many airdrops where I get it from some particular project like Optimism or something, and I just immediately sell. Like, why not? So those who are calling, I think there's it's not an incohesiveness within people, but there are people of different interests calling for different things. Some people are calling for a 180-day lock so that they can get their token quicker. Some people are like for a 500-day lock. Some people want massive reward. Some people understand for like a moderate but large reward. So there's calls from all over. But I'm just highlighting this point that if the reward is too generous, you're then asking for the token to be destroyed, and again it implies cynicism, right? Because it's like, are you in this project or not? If you just want to cash out the moment the unlock happens, then essentially what you're saying is a lack of trust and belief in the product itself, which, okay, fair enough. Okay, and to compare oranges with oranges, there's this idea that, which has been a little bit of an interesting thing to observe, but it's like, without any of these deals on the table, you would just have your I as it is now. So whatever the I price is, like 5 cents. If we give you a reward such that you now get, $3 on the dollar or whatever, you now have more money. We haven't taken money from you. You definitely can't make the accusation that we've taken money. If you make the accusation that we're diluting, again, the dilution argument would only be true if the project is just completely without growth and merit. In which case, maybe state that assumption up front, because then that's what you're complaining about, I guess, is that the project is not going to work. But again, if the project's not going to work with a whole series of fundraising and new developers and so on, then why would it work without that stuff? So again, why would you hold the I at all? So it's just to like compare oranges with oranges, apples with apples. Getting more money isn't stealing money from you. That should hopefully be true. Again, unless the project is a complete like dead end project. But then why do you hold I in the first place anyway, right? So if it's a dead end with the funding, it's a dead end without the funding. That should be clear, because the reason for the dead end will then not be the funding, it'll just be the developer or whatever it is. So again, getting this deal has nothing to do with whether you're worse off or not. If the project's either a dead end to you or it's not, but then in that case, why hold I? Without the lock, if we have absolutely no lock, hopefully that should be clear, but there would be no way to bring on private investment, because the investors don't want to fund your dump, right? So they don't want to pump the price up just so that you can dump it. So that should be obvious. As I said, 300 days. It's not that I'm being pessimistic about the delivery times. If we've got a team of devs, might be a little slow going at first while we hire those devs, but after that, the 300 days is just it's actually to assure everyone that we'll get to the point where we don't have to worry about some massive dump when the 300 days. If it was made at like 100 days, that I think would be a little bit more risky. That would be a little bit more uncertain. So that would be more in line with the worry that we're going to dump. If you're concerned that 300 days is too little, like you think that the project needs more, you can make that case. I personally don't like the idea of the token being locked for like 1,000 days, because I mean, that's insane, right? And you also need these tokens to govern. But I mean, you can make that case. I think 300 days is already like at the high end of things. I don't think most people would be too thrilled if it went to like 400 days. Okay, and then there's been a suggestion for linear unlocking, where it streams, but that is really not appropriate for this sort of token. So for a stablecoin payment, linear streaming is obviously wonderful because now you've got a stream of stable money that if you sell, nothing happens to the price. But if we linearly stream the new governance token, people are going to linearly stream that into an AMM, which is going to linearly drop the price. And so you're just going to see this gradual decline in price from when the token lock is created until it's finally completely claimed. And that's undesirable, right? Because there'll be like periods of time where there won't be any product because it will be under construction. And so there will be people who will just be selling off their token because they don't want to wait for the product to complete. So it kind of defeats the whole point of a lock, because those who want to dump early will dump early. And those who are left holding bags will suffer the consequences. So yes, linear unlock is inappropriate for a system like this. Okay, now this is the final feature that I only like hinted at. I gave a numerical example, but this is the final feature which completely takes away firstly, it takes away the worry of a dump. I'll show you why now. And it also makes Behodler 3 a showcase for future products that want to do token funding. We have a way of producing a product, maybe that we can open source, that will become like a standard in the industry. So I mentioned something called auto weighting, which is how Behodler 3 makes itself rug proof or dump proof. So it detects a token that is in the process of being aggressively dumped, and it weights that token down such that for the person dumping the token, they suddenly encounter a very high slippage. So it's kind of like an immune reaction that Behodler 3 has to the token being rapidly dumped. Kind of bats it off. So this stops the AMM from being drained by either rug pool tokens or just tokens that crash in value. And obviously you need this for a shared liquidity thing. So what we could do is we could have a version of this. So I'm going to talk about the scenario where we have an ultra protection, like an ultra dump proof protection on SCY. In the event that, let's say the unlock period comes before we're ready. Or we just feel that when the unlock period comes, we don't want SCY to be dumped aggressively. So let me take you through that. So the initial step is that we create a regular LP token or an LP position if we're using Uniswap 3 or 4, where we put SCY paired with whatever, like USDC. And then we lock all the other tokens, all the tokens that are allocated to everyone. And so the only way to get SCY is to buy it from this LP. So there's no threat to the SCY price. In the meantime, so this is now while there is a 300-day lock underway, we write like a mini Behodler 3. And this version doesn't have scarcity, but it does have a strict auto weighting. So it's got this auto weighting feature, but it's like dialed up to be very intense. And it's basically like a pair. So it's like a Uniswap pair. Let's call this contract token seller. Once this token seller is tested and ready and so on, we unpair the LP of SCY and USDC and we put it into token seller. So now we've got this pair of USDC SCY, but it's now in this token seller mini Behodler 3. And then after all the tokens unlock, after everyone has their SCY that they want to dump, after they've got their tokens that they want to dump, they can only sell small amounts to get normal slippage. And so if anyone tries to dump a large amount, or if too much is sold in a particular day, we can parameterize it however we want. They would encounter undesirable slippage. And since this is the only LP token in the world that will have SCY, it means that people can sell their SCY, but they need to do it very gradually. They can't shock the market with the SCY. In the meantime, the ecosystem can continue to develop. We can continue to build other sources of liquidity for SCY. And so basically this this particular product, it protects SCY from any dumps. It protects the community of the token. So you can see why this sort of mechanism would be quite desirable for a project wanting to raise funds, because if they put it into this token seller contract, they can give contract level guarantees to the community that even though the tokens are unlocked, they can't just be like whacked and dumped. And because it doesn't have well, I guess you can, this is a design feature, but because you can have it so that it doesn't have scarcity, this mini Behodler, and then you can never have the team, it'll be the equivalent of the team burning the LP tokens, so they can never just remove it suddenly. So that hopefully answers all of your concerns, and it comes with this feature, this Behodler 3 feature at the end, which is the kind of final guarantee against token dumping. I hope this helps. Let me stop recording.